Hello, where are you?
Durham.
And what are we doing here?
Waiting. We've been waiting for 24 hours, roughly. Due to the fact someone got the day wrong.
And what is this bridge called?
I can't remember.
Framwell Gate Bridge. We're waiting to have a tour of Durham in reference to the Dunbar Scots. And up there you can see Durham Castle on the left and Durham Cathedral on the right. And what river is this?
I can't remember.
Oh, that's really handy.
Oh, yeah. It's the weir, as in sign on weir.
No, it's not.
No, I think the parapet may all be new, but the underneath of the bridge was there, and it would have been longer as well because so if you look at it today from the river, there are two arches. There's a third arch which has now disappeared behind the buildings either side of the street as the canal approached on the river. And at that point there would have been a gatehouse. Some of them were obviously came out as servants and labourers in the local industry. So,
they were
working very locally.
but maybe in groups or something,
Yeah.
so that they keep an eye on them. That would have been real easy to read.
So and then this one you can't see from the outside. So so this is also 1600, but altered on the front. So you've got 17th century 18th century windows.
It's just the burial site is specifically buried
We should have come up this way, Alan. We walked up one of the little alleys instead of coming through the market yesterday.
If you walk side lanes, quite odd little alleys. You walk around the back of.
Yeah, we saw some of the local colour.
Yes.
Oh, we did. It's for sure. I have, just the last 4 days, I've taken nearly 500 pictures so through York and Durham and all around. So it'll be fun.
We probably should try to find it. I don't know if we have one or not, but we might have a Dropbox or something that we could all post our pictures.
Be
in. If
happy
we
to.
don't, I will
Be happy
take it upon
to.
myself to make sure we have one.
Building here. Again, an early 17th century building.
Yeah.
They're not making brickwork for the brick there is all later, but internally 17th
So
century,
now,
early 17th.
is there red clay around here? Because we were in York and they said they don't know where the clay came from in the Roman walls because there was no red clay. Is it around here or do you not know?
There's plenty of clay,
Clay.
and particularly some of the coal seams also are adjacent.
I visited was June and I got out of the car and I saw stars for the first time in my life.
Imagine that. Hello.
Katie will just leave it over to you, so alright, brilliant.
This is the cafe that caused the construction work that caused the discovery. The construction because it's between two buildings, there was no real excavation there. They just removed the topsoil and laid floor. But out here they put in this fire escape, and that is where the deep excavations came. So from here onward, there was a deep excavation in order to put in staircase. And in this corner, about a metre and a half, there was about 18 skeletons found in this corner. And then under the wall, that edge, this edge here, another 9. That's the point. So the stone is set on a stone that comes from the quarry at Dunbar, which is on the part of the battlefield.
And that's Windy Gap there.
I like this little metal thing.
Great, they'll work. Razor wire and spikes.
All the time through history that this happened,
But
and
we didn't know
then
where.
yeah, but I mean, nobody
presumed
even
it would
knew
be
for
in the
sure.
cathedral graveyard.
Ah,
So if you ever come to our lectures, we talk about a zigzag of buildings through the site. So this is one of the bishop's stables, and then you see the roof of the other one going at an angle across the end there, and then the third one that goes out in that direction. So these are probably late 17th century, or possibly early 18th century.
how the fireworks.
Right. So some of it is similar.
It's a little bigger than the one there.
Yes.
They did, the lady at the National Park Service told me to pass it on the error. And she may have let you know, but the McIntyre Garrison is not the oldest house in the community. Because they have that. Yeah, but it's not the oldest house. Actually, I have an older, I have an older house in Rhode Island that is in my ancestry, so it's really
No,
expensive.
it's the oldest.
It might be in Maine.
The oldest stone building in Maine.
It might be Maine,
Um,
but it's still pretty. What they had to do is they put them mostly on the borders, so when the Native Americans came through, they were the.
projecting angle encodes a staircase from the 1660s. So it was a bishop cousin. So that's after the soldiers were here. Before that, probably to get from that wing to this wing, you would have had to come outside. There was internal connection. And then on this side, the Great Hall, underneath it, there's an undercroft. So there's a lot of space in there. So we think that's probably the primary place that the sick men were taken to nursed. But there's a lot of other space that could have been used.
And who would have done the nursing?
They say that they hired old women from around,
The wise
from
women.
around, and they gave them boiled milk and various other things. So there's actually quite a lot of detail about what they said they were doing. Help preserve it as well. So this is one of the most spectacularly preserved pieces of Romanesque architecture.
It's amazing.
So the space here was originally the medieval hall of the front, and it's now subdivided into lots of rooms. There are, we're not allowed to go up there, but so there are rooms up there that may have been used for nursing soldiers. It's quite possible there's another floor above. We did do a training session for tour guides So there's a group called Durham Pointers who guide tourists in the marketplace, and the cathedral guides, and they all came and we did a session in the department for them. I did 3 different groups in an hour.
Oh my
And
gosh.
I keep going places and people say, oh, I know you, and I don't remember them at all.
Now you want to
These 2 tombs are from the Neville family, who were major rulers of the area in the Middle Ages, and it was one of them, Bishop Neville, who led the troops to the Battle of Neville's Cross and defeated the Scots. So there's a story that the prisoners damaged these tombs because of that. But there is on this one, there's an engraving of 1642. Someone's written 1642 into the graffiti. So it not only tells you the time, it tells you phases of the moon and various other things like that. And again, there's a story that the soldiers didn't destroy this because of the thistle, the emblem of Scotland. But actually, we've got evidence that by the time that they came here, the clock had been dismantled and was in storage somewhere.
They weren't taking any chances.
But here we see more evidence.
Hello.
Where are we?
The A68, is it? Or A69? We're heading towards Dunbar on our way to Melrose. We're at the Scottish borders. It's absolutely beautiful. Take a nice look around.
England.
The sign there says this is the Lightning Moor National Nature Reserve. Oh, here we are, look. Scotland!
stragglers.
From just behind Lauderdale House, we'll be parading down the High Street and then down Spot Road down to that event field where events will open at 11 a.m. and they'll run throughout the course of the day, and they'll see an opportunity for you to learn about the Battle of Dunbar and the soldiers that fought in it, its importance, and of course, if you are able to stay for the main battle display at 3 o'clock and the skirmish displays at 1, and the conditions in which they were held. But if they could survive those trials, many of those prisoners were then sent off to create new lives on the other side of the world. Some of them sold as indentured servants, and many of them making new lives for themselves after 7 long years of service in the early phases of the North American colonies. And so we're delighted to welcome members of the Scottish Prisoners of War Society here who've travelled from North America and from all over North America to Dunbar this weekend to join with us in commemorating the experiences of their ancestors and celebrating the common heritage which binds us all together in the 21st century. So before we pause to remember the soldiers of 1650 and indeed the long period of civil wars which preceded them, it's an opportunity just to pause and remember why so many soldiers were fighting and laying their lives on the line in 1650 on the fields outside this town. It had all really come down to a matter of whether or not there should be a king ruling in Scotland, England and Ireland. The Scots had formed a national covenant at the end of the 1630s, arguing against royal privileges over particularly the Scottish Church. And so the Scots had raised their arms against King Charles I, who was King of England and Scotland at the time. What followed was a series of conflicts which resulted in Scottish successes, but which put such strain on Charles I's government in England that it created the context for a civil war which racked England, Scotland and Ireland right through the 1640s. Eventually, after an alliance between the Scottish and English parliaments, the English parliament was triumphant and brought the king to heel, and in 1649, King Charles I was executed at Whitehall. But Charles I was King of Scots as well as King of England. And so, the Scots, having heard of the execution of the king, immediately proclaimed his son, the Prince of Wales, to be King Charles II, not just of Scotland, but of Great Britain and Ireland. At the very same moment, the English Parliament was abolishing monarchy and forming a republic. And so you had this unworkable situation, it seemed, where Scotland had welcomed the Stuarts back at the end of the civil wars and established the Stuart monarchy again, and of course, in England, a new republic, in which a rising star was no less a figure than Oliver Cromwell. And it was the English Parliament's fear that the Scots, having accepted Charles II and having invited him back to Scotland, would lead an invasion of England, which triggered a preemptive strike from the English parliamentarian forces. And the result was, in the summer of 1650, Oliver Cromwell led an army into Scotland, and he decided to use Dunbar and the old harbour beyond us here as his supply base as he moved his army towards Edinburgh. He expected a quick and decisive victory, but it was not to be. The Scottish commander, General David Leslie, assembled a very formidable, large army, and he blocked Cromwell's path at Edinburgh. And repeatedly, Cromwell tried to break through, and repeatedly he was thwarted. And eventually, he was forced back to his supply base here at Dunbar. and so the stage was set for the confrontation of the battle itself. General Leslie initially taking his positions on the top of Doon Hill, which towers over the landscape here, and Cromwell wondering whether he was going to be obliged to evacuate his army or even surrender it, in what could have been a career-destroying decision. But when the Scottish army descended from Doon Hill to take up a new position on the 2nd of September, Cromwell saw an opportunity, a chance to attack the flank of the Scots forces and break through towards the road to England. And so he launched a pre-dawn attack on the 3rd of September, an attack which caught the Scottish sentries by surprise, drove in the Scottish flank, and as the Scottish flank collapsed, Cromwell saw an opportunity, not just to defeat the Scottish army and to break free, but to destroy the Scottish army and turn what looked like an imminent defeat here at Dunbar into a remarkable and unexpected victory. And so it was to be. It did not end the war. There would be years of fighting in Scotland still afterwards. There would be another great battle at Inverkeithing, fighting over towards Glasgow, at Hamilton. There would be another great campaign when Charles II took control of the army himself and marched it down to Worcester and was defeated in turn on the first anniversary of the Battle of Dunbar. So Dunbar did not end the war, it did not solve the problems, but it did end a long period of considerable Scottish military success, and it broke the spirit of resistance, the unity that had held the Covenanting movement together until that moment. It was a dramatic and it was a significant and wide-reaching impact the battle had. But it's worth us remembering that the battle was fought by individual soldiers. And so we're delighted that some of the reenactors who will be taking part in this weekend's reenactment activities have been able to join us here in the battery, and they're looming relatively menacingly over you up there by the battery wall. The soldiers of 1650 were not, in the Scots army, professional soldiers, the majority of them. Most of them were people like you and I who'd been forced out by a national levy, motivated, of course, by not only their political and religious convictions, but also the sense that this was a national crisis and there was an invading army inside the kingdom. The Scots soldiers were most commonly dressed in the ubiquitous hodden grey that you see most of the soldiers sporting there. But you'll see that the officer on the far end of the line is rather more splendidly attired, wearing his own fine suit of clothes and his position and status, making him visible so that the soldiers will be able to follow his direction into battle. The Scots army, like the Cromwellian army that they faced, was composed of pike and shot in its infantry wing. And you see those soldiers there on the end with their two long pikes. And these were aggressive battlefield winners, large formations of pikemen who we often think fought defensively, but actually could be very significant, driving across a battlefield, a formidable force of pikes driving towards to physically push the opposing formations off the battlefield, supported on each side by wings of musketeers. Because this is an age when the firearm is beginning to take dominance across the battlefield. And so those musketeers were really crucial in providing the protection for the pike blocks, but also the firepower that would dominate the area of combat. The Cromwellian soldiers would have been equipped very similarly, and you see indeed two soldiers here, musketeers from Oliver Cromwell's army, and these men were, unlike some of the levies in the Scottish forces, very experienced. There was a lot of experience within parts of the Scottish army, but Cromwell's army had not stopped at the end of the civil wars. It had kept fighting through the late 1640s in both England and in Cromwell's campaigns in Ireland, and there was a great deal of deep-seated professionalism through all ranks of Cromwell's forces. And so it was a formidable army that Cromwell led into Scotland. And although it suffered from sickness and through the tactical defeats that had been inflicted on it by the Scottish forces in Edinburgh, it remained a formidable hardened and battle-winning army as the largest Scottish force at Dunbar would discover to its cost. Behind me here we have a colour, an important colour. Flags were very significant on the battlefields of the 17th century, and it's worth us just reflecting on this particular flag. This is the flag of the King's Lifeguard of Foot, which was established in 1650 for Charles II when he arrived in Scotland. And it is a fine symbol of the difficulties of the political situation at the time. For on the one side, you see the royal arms of Charles II himself, and on the reverse, you see the covenanting motto, the covenant for religion, king and kingdoms. Because this is an army which is trying to bring together royalists, covenanters, moderates, men of all sorts of different political leanings. Those who were overtly royalist were still denied a position of authority in the army in 1650. And there had been purges to make sure that they didn't gain a presence within the army. So the Scots were almost as afraid of some of the political situation within their own ranks as they were of their enemies. So they were difficult times. They were hard times for you to decide which side you should support. And there were those within the Scots army that fought at Dunbar who would later decide in the coming weeks and months that they perhaps politically had more in common with Cromwell and his campaigns than with those they'd been fighting alongside until then. So all of those tensions and difficulties and choices are important for us to remember as context in our minds when we're thinking about the events of Dunbar. But what we also have to remember is that the majority of soldiers like these above you would have had nothing more than the instinctive response to the national levies that the nation, Scotland, has called them out in arms. At this point, we will take the opportunity to remember all of those who fought on all sides at the Battle of Dunbar, at the battles which preceded it over the 12 years of conflict beforehand, and of course those in the battles which were yet to come. We will have a volley of honour from the musketeers who are on the parapet, who will fire their volley across the wall over the old harbour, which supplied Cromwell's army, towards the battlefield beyond. I'll invite you please, after the gunfire, to hold a moment's silence, at the conclusion of which Fergus McClintock, who is up there as our piper for the evening, will play a lament in honour of all those who fought and fell.
Your right hand about face. Close to your toe. Secure the scouring sticks. Present your muskets. Prepare to give fire. Give fire! Your cover. Your right hand about face. Cover your arm. All your muscles. Silence. Figure 4, salute. Recover.
Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause please for our reenactors. And of course, for our hyper-progress. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope this has just set the scene just a little for you in terms of why we're commemorating these events of 1650 here in 2019. And I hope that many of you and all of your friends and family, of course, will come and join us for the rest of the weekend down in the fields off Spot Road to continue remembering the soldiers and the sacrifices of the civil wars. Thank you very much.
I don't know what the time is.
You can tell the true story about the sign now. She was going to get a big one. She was going to get a big one printed out, and she was messing it up. So I did it. We got it sent back, but I spelt descendant wrong.
It's a tricky word. It's a tricky word. Was it ENT at the end?
Yeah.
Anyone could make that. Look, you got some campers out here. Must be the reenactors, huh?
Not the one I'm bringing. This is my stage. Small, yeah. Even though down behind.
Yeah.
There were so many people taking part in this battle that if you took every person who lives in Dunbar today, put them on a horse, then they would roughly equal the numbers of the cavalry engagement on one end of the battle line. There were almost perhaps as much as 35,000 people in the fields of Dunbar for the battle over the course of the 1st, 2nd and 3rd of September 1650. And behind me here, like our looking glass to the past, is a really crude, badly drawn map, which I can say because I did it, of the Dunbar in 1650. So what I'll do, just relatively briefly, is talk through the landscape of the battle and then the movements of the two armies during the course of the 3 days, because those movements were critical to the outcome of the engagement. Now the most important thing is this road, which comes from England, from Berwick-upon-Tweed, roughly parallel with the A1 that's over there, and it comes down the coast. It crosses the Broxburn, which is this burn running all the way to Spot over there, and it crosses it at a ford, and that ford is now a stone bridge that way next to Broxburn village. So this road is still in existence. There is a little shepherd's hut, a little cottage, which is roughly where the triangular roofed lodge house to Broxmouth House is today, if any of you are familiar with that spot on the roadside. Although for the purposes of us this weekend, that little shepherd's hut cottage there is in that field behind the tents for the displays later on today. There were 3 fords that you could use to get across the Broxburn. The main one, which carried the road to England, the coastal one, which is down on where Dunbar Golf Course is today, and there was a 3rd one at Brands Mill. There was another small ford, there it is, written in small letters, in Oswald Dean, and the only other crossing point was up at Spot, where the Doom Bridge is still today. So this burn, from about here onwards, runs through a very steep-sided ravine, which still weaves its way between Dunbar and Spot like a scar through the landscape, very visible, and you can see it very clearly from the fields beyond us there and from the A1. And this ravine will become very important to us. If you were travelling from England, like Cromwell was when he first appeared, you would cross the ford and you would pass the enclosures of Broxmouth House. The house which is there today is built on the same footprint as the original, but is an 18th century replacement. So it's not the original house, but it is in the same spot, and its enclosures were around it. And as you see, the road diverges. The bypass road that heads out towards Haddington through East Linton, and the link road that connects to Dunbar itself up here. There is Loch End House, which was a very fine and comfortable residence in the mid-17th century. Dunbar itself, with the High Street, of course, exactly where it is today. The church just outside the limits of the town. You can see the church over there. It is not the same building, but it is on exactly the same spot, and it's on a nice prominent mound, so that it was a very good vantage point for the soldiers. The castle at Dunbar Harbour was already in ruins in 1650, so was not usable as a defensive feature, and there was only one harbour in 1650, where the old harbour still is today, now known as the Cromwell Harbour, not because of any connection to the battle, but because Cromwell's government gave a grant for its repair after a storm later in the 1650s. Probably because of the fond memories the Lord Protector had. And then, of course, the road from Dunbar running off through Belhaven and then reconnecting to this road as it heads towards East Linton. Overlooking all of this landscape is this mound of hills over here. Which are those hills over there? That is Doon Hill. And behind it, although you can't see it from here, is Brunt Hill just beyond. And on the lip of this low ridge which runs in front of Doon Hill, which you can just make out as the ploughed fields there across the road, were two farms, Little and Michael Pinkerton, which are both still there conveniently as landmarks for us. All the way down here, at the bottom of that shoulder of Doon Hill, is Spot House, which is a private residence still, but is still there. So this is the landscape of the battlefield at Dunbar. Oliver Cromwell had visited Dunbar on his way up in July towards Edinburgh, and he was using Dunbar Harbour as his supply base for his invasion of Scotland. On his first visit he was a bit disappointed because there was no fleet there to meet him, so he went on regardless, marched on Edinburgh. But the army that I had assembled in Edinburgh managed to thwart his plans to take the city, and Cromwell was obliged eventually to withdraw back to his supply base, where he did at last manage to link up with some supply ships and get some tentage for his soldiers at last. He then marched back on Edinburgh and was thwarted for a second time. And then, on the last day of August 1650, after weeks of miserable campaigning in terrible weather, Cromwell finally retired out of Musselburgh and withdrew to Dunbar for the final time. He was attacked by the Scottish Lancers, who you will see in action later on today. He was attacked at Musselburgh, and then he was attacked again at Haddington as they pushed Cromwell's army back towards the border. Dysentery had broken out in Cromwell's ranks. The army was losing men to sickness and illness as quickly as it was to Scottish lance points, and Cromwell was in serious trouble because if the weather continued to deteriorate and if his supply fleet was not able to keep the army fed, then this army that was going to withdraw for the third time to Dunbar was potentially going to become trapped, sickly and tired, and ultimately defeated. By the time Cromwell got here on the 1st of September 1650, he drew his army, having come from Haddington, through East Linton, and he brought the army down into these fields here, in front of Loch End estate, which is just beyond us here. He drew the army up here, withdrawing his baggage and his heavy cannons to the kirkyard at Dunbar Church up there. And he waited for David Leslie to appear in order to give him battle. But the Scots army wasn't prepared to face him on his terms, and the Scots army came on the different road, and it took up a new position up there on the summit of that hill. So imagine that hill with around 15,000 men in formation on the top. And it must have looked hugely formidable to Cromwell's small army down here in Dunbar itself. Cromwell by this point has around 7,500 infantry against about 14,000 or 15,000 Scots. He has around 3,500 cavalry, the elite of his army, heavy horsemen, against the Scots, something like 6,000 or 7,000 cavalry. So on every way of measuring, Cromwell was at a disadvantage, and he said in his own correspondence, "I am becoming sensible of our disadvantages here in Dunbar." Cromwell essentially, with the army up there on the top of Doon Hill, and his own army down here, was in danger of becoming trapped. And that's what David Leslie wanted. He wanted the army up there to prevent Cromwell from marching on Edinburgh again, or from being able to escape to safety in Berwick-upon-Tweed. Now the Scots army spent the 1st of September on the top of that hill. It was raining and it was windy. And if any of you have ever stood on the top of that hill in the wind and the rain, you will understand why, after one night Scottish officers started to contemplate coming down. The other point was that from the top of the hill, actually the Scots army cannot control the landscape. Although it looks like an impregnable position, that's a problem, because Cromwell is never going to attack him up there, so there will be no fighting, and it takes that long to get a big army off the top of a hill like that if Cromwell makes a sudden dash down the road to England, then David Leslie will struggle to get his army down in time to stop him. So on the 2nd of September, the Scots army makes a fateful decision. It will come down off that hill and take up a new position along the front of it. So the Scots army, you can imagine them descending the two slopes either side of the hill, coming down, watched by Oliver Cromwell from his perspective glasses in Broxmouth House, and watched from other English officers at the church over there. And the new position formed up with the ravine in front of the Scots line and the hill behind, along that ridge behind us. David Leslie's priority was to close the road. He wanted to make sure that Cromwell couldn't break out. He sent a small force to occupy the Pass of Pease down at Coburn's Path, to close the road further. And as Cromwell used the word, Leslie shogged the army towards the sea. So once they were down, they moved their strength, all of their cavalry virtually assembled in the coastal area to close this access point off and trap Cromwell's army there in Dunbar. So this area where the quarry and the artificial lock and the caravan park are today, over here, is the area in front of the Scottish cavalry line. So imagine the Scots line, 1.5 miles long, stretching from the sea all the way down towards Doon Bridge over in Spot that way. It continues to rain all through the 2nd of September. Cromwell moves his army forwards and lines up directly opposite David Leslie's army, facing himself at Broxmouth. It's a miserable day. It's so wet and windy that Cromwell's men can't put their tents up for most of the day. They're starting to get a bit worried. But the more Cromwell looks at this line, the more he senses there's a potential opportunity. Because this ravine that protects the front of the Scottish army also stops most of the Scottish soldiers being able to manoeuvre, because they're in a relatively constricted landscape. And so, if Cromwell can muster his strength, he decides that he might be able to attack across the fords, break through the area of the Scottish army here, and get control of that road back to England, which at least would save him from having to evacuate his army by sea or to surrender ignominiously without a battle. So, at about 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening on the 2nd of September, Cromwell holds a council of war at Broxmouth House over there, and they decide that this is what they're going to do. During the night, the whole Cromwellian army moves from this line into a column along this road between the parish church, past the deer park, and to Broxmouth. And they will attack down the road and hopefully clear enough space to get themselves safely to Berwick. Leslie and the main Scottish officer corps withdraw to Spot House, out of the rain, that way. So they inadvertently end up about 1.75 miles away from the point where Cromwell is planning to attack. Cromwell's attack is delayed, but eventually by about 5 AM it gets moving, and the column comes across the 3 fords. The main attack coming through along the road. They first clear the Scottish sentries and pickets in this area, and then the Cromwellian heavy horse come riding down and smash into the Scottish cavalry lines that are over here. And remember, those Scots are not expecting an attack. They believe that they might well be asked to attack the following day, because they are the bigger army and they have bottled their enemy up, and they are sure that they're about to surrender. So this attack comes completely by surprise. Cromwell also sends some of his men round Broxmouth, through the golf course, across the ford, and they come in this way. The first Scottish infantry line that's over here gets caught completely by surprise and gets smashed open. And that creates lots of space in this area for Cromwell's cavalry to start manoeuvring. But the next section of the Scottish line over here, by Little Pinkerton, recovers its balance quickly, realises the seriousness of what's happening. It's a very experienced division, and they manage to hold their nerve and push the Cromwellian foot soldiers back towards the ford along the way behind this field. But as time goes on, this small part of the Scottish army becomes increasingly isolated, because most of the Scottish soldiers along here don't have the room to wheel round to support them because of that ravine and burn in front of them. Also, in this bowl here, above the ravine, which is just down there above Brand's Mill, Cromwell puts his heavy artillery, and those cannons are able to fire into all parts of the Scottish line, rather putting some of the regiments off from their desire to move forwards to support the others. Cromwell's cavalry are, after about an hour of back and forth fighting over the landscape of the loch and the quarry area here, the cavalry are eventually victorious, and Cromwell is able to turn his horses around and bring them smashing into the side of that successful Scottish division over here, breaking it and routing it. And then for the rest of the Scottish line back here,
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Now back in the small arena in the Living History encampment area, at past there will be an opportunity for the children to come and learn a little more about the Battle of Dunbar.
Trees start returning fire. At the moment, the cavalry are purely concentrating their attack on the pickets, on the sentries here, and ignoring the rest of the Scots army. Of course, the people we cannot see at the moment are the Scots cavalry, and if you remember from earlier in the day, there are 5,000 of them over towards the coast, and it may yet be that the Cromwellian cavalry, and indeed that is exactly what they clearly wish to do, may wish to go to the coast and attack the cavalry there, because otherwise the Scots cavalry will come onto the field and clear all before them. They have encountered a small Scots force there and have clearly decided to engage them first. Onto the field now come the Cromwellian infantry. And off go the cavalry, having decided, I think, to engage the Scots cavalry at the coast. As if they do not do so, then those Scots cavalry could come on to his forces. Leslie has clearly ordered the Scots to join up into one force to engage the Cromwellians, but they're still at some considerable distance at the moment. The Scots have an advantage in numbers, as you can see. Bit of an impasse because nobody can come to support them either. And if the Cromwellian cavalry have gone to fight the Scots horse, then they can't expect any cavalry support. It's difficult for the pike to advance whilst the musketeers continue to fire at each other. As you can see, the muskets take some considerable time to fire and load, but they can be very effective, simply fired into quite a large force of men, because it doesn't matter if they're accurate then, they will eventually hit something. Scots identifiable by their bonnets, and the Cromwellians differentiated by their morions, their helmets, or the high hats. And here come the English pike, and then the musketeers advancing to back them up. You see they're fighting at point, which is exactly how they would have fought at the time. And there is Leslie on his horse, observing as to how his army is doing. At the moment, the Scots still have the advantage of numbers. Cromwellians are stuck because without breaking the Scots' flank, no other infantry can advance behind them. But again, the Scots have no further support. The Cromwellian pikemen start to drive the Scots back, although it goes back and forward. And the musketeers advance on each other. It's very difficult to be completely accurate with a musket at this kind of range. It's perfectly possible for two blocks of musketeers to fire at each other and actually not inflict any casualties whatsoever at this kind of... But obviously the closer they get, the more chance there is of being accurate, but inflicting damage on themselves. The more times they fire, the more chance they have of misfires, of the guns not working, of the guns exploding, of them frankly being better just beating each other to death with the ends of the guns. Each one of the bandoliers that they carry has one charge of gunpowder, so in effect each musketeer probably has 12 shots, and then he's got to have a think about whether he can carry on. Most of these battles did not last tremendously long. David Leslie is trying to encourage the Scots forces to move forward, but the pikemen are moving back. Really, probably the big change in this battle will come when the cavalry, which you can't see at the moment, whether the cavalry, the Cromwellian forces have managed to defeat the Scots cavalry, or whether the very large Scots force have managed to overcome the terrifying and famous Cromwellian Ironsides. both sides are tired and hungry and have been in the field for a very long time. Who wants to win more? God and Parliament or God and the King? Choose your sides, ladies and gentlemen. Do you want the Scots to win?
Yes!
Or the English?
Yes!
Oh, I think we know who has the popular vote at least. And here come the pikemen again to engage once more. These pikes would have been very sharp, so if you got caught by one in the thigh, you see they wear a back, many of them are wearing armour on their top part, on their back and breast, but they're not wearing, as they might have done a century before, anything on their legs. So there's always a possibility of getting stabbed in their legs, in their arms. And here come the cavalry! The cavalry have defeated the Scots cavalry. Cromwell has returned. He's clearly routed the Scots, which is obviously going to make a difference in this battle, and he goes straight charging into the pike. And the musketeers clearly are going to have to try and defend their pike. And as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, many of them have turned their muskets round and are using them more like clubs to try and attack the horse. This is going to make a difference. This is going to tip the balance, because although there are more Scots, they cannot fight the cavalry in the same way. You see, they've been forced into a defensive manoeuvre, something you might call a hedgehog. The spines of the pike are poking out, utterly neutralises the numerical advantage that they had, and the cavalry are surrounding them, and forward come the Cromwellian forces, able to drive the Scots back. Leslie himself is in danger now. He's engaging directly with some of the cavalry. And as you can see, actually, some of the Scots are being forced to flee. There's nothing else they can do. So, many of them are dead, and some of them are being forced to run away. Leslie himself is being forced to flee. And there he goes. Off the field. Lost his hat. Cromwell is victorious. Possibly not the most popular of victories, but he's definitely a victor. So as you can see, here come some of the prisoners being brought forward, apart from the Scots that lay dead upon the field. obviously Cromwell takes the prisoners to south, having let the wounded go, as I'm sure he knows, in fact, there was still a parliament in Scotland in 1650. That's kind of why the Scots were fighting. I'd like to thank every single reenactor who was taking part on the field, including the ones who are lying down, who might like to get up at some point. I'd also like to thank the troop who provided the horses, all of the people who have helped us here today, the Scottish Battlefield Trust, who are the ones who have organised this event, and all of you who are attending, and the cadets who put in so much work with helping. Thank you very much for watching in what has been a slightly windy conditions.
So where are we? There she goes.
This is the Broxburn ravine, and then the stream that comes here. So, here's the Broxburn Bridge. Dunbar, where the castle's at.
Here it comes, hop along. Slowly.
The lighthouse from here, but I don't recall being able to see this lighthouse. They must have just had lights off, I guess. We're at the battery on Dunbar Harbour. Oh, no wind at this corner. That's good. That feels better. Here's Doon Hill. I'm gonna go back.
trudge, 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 trudge. Where are we?
Tantalon Castle. Did I pronounce that right? We're near North Berwick, and that's Bass Rock out there. We're watching all the gannets in the water and in the air. The sun's come out, and it's beautiful. I'm going up here.
What is it?
Well, we would call it a dovecote, but it's a dewcot. This is where they housed pigeons, hundreds of them, to provide meat and eggs for the castle. I've never seen a dovecote this big. Look at the size of it. I love it. I'm gonna walk in. It's kind of neat, isn't it?
I don't like anyone whistling, I say. I never have done that. That's a superstition. I think to, you know, soldiers whistle, sailors sing. We call it whistling for wind.
Stormy Bob kept his gear now.
Every inch of storage, every bit of it. Fish deck.
Coal to oil. You saw these men and they became like Mr. Michelin. You know, where they're not doing this physical work. And I mean, when they were pulling a fire, And it's very hot, and the sweat used to roll off them. You never got any, all the fibres were all lean, mean, lean, hungry types.
Your son cooks wouldn't allow you in the galley. They would brandish a knife at him.
When you're at sea, you dare not upset the cook. Not at all, you dare not. He was at his mercy. I mean, if the cook packs in, throws his hand in, the crew's finished. The crew want to, oh, we don't want anybody to cook for us, we're finished, you know, so you just got to make back to port and change your cook.
The atmosphere was bloody still everywhere. And if you've got a good cook, you live very, very well.
GoPro off. That day we stepped off what was known as Donkey's Breakfast.
Five men on a vessel. When I say on a vessel, I mean employed at Navy. They'll have perhaps 3,000 kit, something like that. And I would think 8-9 hours, something like that.
Yeah, in a way you were responsible, but
I would think down Freeman Street, that there'd be 50, 60 pubs and about 12 songbooks.
Here, they have the unfortunate experience, having only just got up, of seeing cannon firing into them from front and sides from across the burn. They've got some dragoons hiding in the scrub along the burn side, firing at them periodically to remind them there are still people in front, so they're worried about what that might be. And then they see all of their comrades from one of the more experienced parts of the army running towards them, having been broken already. And as those men run through them, disordering their ranks, the sun just starts to come up, and it illuminates the fact that behind those fleeing Scots are Cromwell's heavy Ironsides, the elite heavy cavalry, and they come charging in along the front, sides and back of the Scottish flank, driving it backwards, smashing it up, and Cromwell describes the foot soldiers as like stubble beneath the swords of his horsemen. It's a devastating cascade from there as the Scottish army disintegrates and the only thing that the commanders can do is try to rally as much as they can, get them back across the burn and head them off towards Haddington, where they are pursued all of the way for 8 or so miles by Cromwell's triumphant horsemen. All of it wrapped up and done before 6:30 in the morning. It was a devastating morning for the Scottish Army, with anything between 800 and 3,000 casualties on the field, and then huge numbers of prisoners taken. Those who were wounded were released as prisoners. Those who were not, and who were potentially a threat to continue, were marched by Cromwell's men off towards Durham, and you can find out more about their story inside. But needless to say, Cromwell's soldiers were struggling to feed themselves. How much less were they able to suddenly feed thousands of Scottish prisoners? The battle itself, although short and sharp and furious, was not decisive in the long-term course of the war. This did not end the fighting, but what it did do is change the nature of the political scene in Scotland, because the Scottish Covenanters had accepted Charles II when he had agreed to their religious terms, and they wanted him to be a much constricted king in his royal prerogatives. But after the Battle of Dunbar, the Scottish leadership politically was so discredited that Charles II was able to effectively take personal command of what left of the army, and they crowned him king at Scone in January, and the initiative and the direction of the war was handed over to Charles and the royalist factions in Scotland, which at Dunbar had been very much held at bay by the forces of the Scottish Parliament. That leads to Cromwell having to chase Charles II's new Scottish army out of Scotland in 1651 as far as Worcester, where they fought on the first anniversary of the Battle of Dunbar and were again defeated. And that leads to Charles II famously hiding in his oak tree before heading back into exile. Even after Worcester, there is still sporadic fighting in parts of Scotland, but essentially the stuffing has been knocked out of resistance by those battles, and a series of very significantly sized, very expensive fortifications are built across Scotland, and effectively Scotland is absorbed into the new Commonwealth of England and becomes, until the restoration of the king in 1660, 10 years after the Battle of Dunbar, a republic. But eventually the king does return, invited and brought back to power by Colonel Monk, and Monk, who is so instrumental in bringing Charles II back to power, had led the first infantry regiments across this burn at the Battle of Dunbar, fighting against the king's forces. David Leslie and Oliver Cromwell knew each other personally. They knew how they fought, they knew what to expect of one another, and they knew how formidable each other could be. But ultimately, Cromwell was able to make that critical decision in the middle of the battle, that this is not just an opportunity to break through towards England, but by the speed of the collapse of the Scottish line, it was an opportunity to turn a tactical victory into the destruction of the Scottish army. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Please do talk to the